The fate of our house was written among the stars. The Great Serpent tells us there is nothing to fear.
Do not repeat. Not for.
At least, not for those who walk the path. You will rise as Va'ruun.
Everyone agrees on what House Va'ruun is: dangerous, fanatical, a cult wrapped in the language of cosmic destiny, wielding theology the way other factions wield fleets. The kind of belief system that polite civilization keeps at arm's length, that politicians invoke when they need a convenient face for extremism, that travelers learn to eye with practiced unease when they notice those angular Va'ruun symbols carved into a wall or stitched into a cloak at the wrong kind of port. The settled systems has found its way to a working peace with its two great powers, the United Colonies and the Freestar Collective, and it has found a stable enough arrangement with the other factions that exist in the space between. But Va'ruun sits in a different category, not a political rival, not an irritant, something closer to a held breath, something the galaxy knows is out there, somewhere beyond the reach of its oversight, believing things that polite civilization has decided cannot be safely believed, and waiting, with a patience that is itself unsettling, for something no one else can see coming. And that is exactly where it becomes interesting, because the version of Va'ruun that most people carry, the shorthand, the warning label, the story told in the cautionary registers of settled systems culture, was assembled largely by people who had every reason to fear Va'ruun and very limited incentive to understand it. The record of survival is not the same as the record of truth. The political order that grew out of the armistice is not neutral about its own origin story. And House Va'ruun, for reasons that have as much to do with its theology as its politics, has never invested much effort in correcting the version of itself that the rest of the galaxy has settled on. It closed its world. It limited its diplomacy to the barest formal minimum. It retreated behind the wall of its own faith and let the galaxy believe what it wanted to believe. That is not the behavior of an innocent party, necessarily, but it is also not the behavior of an organization with nothing to protect. Somewhere in the distance between the warning label and the reality is the actual story of House Va'ruun, a story that is stranger, older, and more philosophically serious than most people in the settled systems have been given reason to suspect. A story that begins not with violence or politics, but with something much quieter. A single person in the dark, hearing something enormous, and having to decide what to do with what they had heard. The question worth sitting with is not whether Va'ruun is dangerous. It is whether we have ever actually looked at what Va'ruun is. The faith began, as so many things do, with someone who could not stop hearing something no one else could hear. The Prophet, Va'ruun's founding figure, the person whose visions became the load-bearing architecture of a belief system that would eventually reshape the political geometry of human civilization, is not a figure that recorded history preserves with great clarity. That is itself significant. The United Colonies keeps meticulous institutional records. The Freestar Collective maintains its own archival tradition with the protective care of a people who know that their founding story is also their legal argument. But the earliest chapters of the Va'ruun faith exist in a kind of documentary shadow, known more through devotional literature and centuries of theological commentary than through the dispassionate record-keeping that the galaxy's other powers produce as naturally as breathing. What survives is mostly Va'ruun's own account of itself, filtered through generations of true believers who understood their prophet's visions not as events to be documented, but as revelation to be carried, copied, and passed forward. What that account tells us is this: the prophet, Jinan Va'ruun, a passenger aboard the colony ship Archimedes, which had departed New Atlantis in 2190 and been reported lost, received communications from something vast and patient during the ship's final grav jump. Not a deity in the traditional sense, not a conscious architect of existence, not a being that governs the universe's moral structure or intervenes in the lives of the faithful in ways that look like providence. Something older and more fundamental than those constructs. Something that had been there since before the galaxy took its current shape. An entity that, in the disoriented stillness of that jump, reached into Jinan's experience and made itself known. The Great Serpent. Not a metaphor assembled by theologians to give shape to abstract forces. Not a symbol standing in for entropy or time or the heat-death of the universe. An entity, or something close enough to an entity that the philosophical distinction may not be meaningful, whose fundamental nature involves the eventual reclamation of what it made. The Great Serpent, according to what Jinan brought back from that communion, created the Milky Way galaxy in ages so distant they precede any human concept of history. It then entered a hibernation lasting countless millennia, not gone but sleeping, recovering its strength. And now, in Jinan's account, it was finally stirring. The Shrouding was the Va'ruun name for what came next, the moment the serpent fully awakened and moved to reclaim its creation. The prophet did not experience that communion as simple horror. This much can be inferred from what he did next. No person who came back from that encounter purely terrified would have spent the rest of his life building a civilization around it. For Jinan, it appears the revelation of the Great Serpent carried something other than dread, an overwhelming sense of truth, of being made suddenly aware of something real that most conscious beings were not equipped to perceive. That experience, whatever its precise emotional texture, clearly felt to him like contact, not punishment. The serpent is not described in Va'ruun theology as something that hates the things it will reclaim. It created them. It is patient with them in the way that something vast and ancient can afford patience. Whether the serpent regards its eventual return to those things with anything approaching feeling is a question the theology does not answer, and one might reasonably assume does not consider the right question to ask. And the faith built on that foundation is not, at its core, a faith of despair. This is the second thing worth understanding, and perhaps the harder one to internalize. To know the Great Serpent is not, in Va'ruun theology, to learn that nothing matters. It is to learn that everything matters in the context of what it is, temporary, specific, real, in the way that only things with defined endings can be real. To know the serpent is to know your place in something that existed before you and will exist long after everything you have built has been gathered into the serpent's slow coils, and that knowledge, in the theological tradition Va'ruun has cultivated across its history, is not diminishing. It is, for believers who have fully inhabited it, a source of something that looks remarkably like peace. But the mandate Jinan brought back was not only for himself. It was for everyone on that ship, and eventually for everyone beyond it. Follow the Great Serpent, Jinan told them, or be devoured when the shrouding comes. That pairing, the promise of belonging alongside the threat of consumption for those who refused, is the original structure of the Va'ruun call to faith. It was not a gentle invitation, it was a declaration about the nature of the universe, framed with the full weight of what Jinan had experienced and delivered to people who had not experienced it and had to decide whether to believe him. Most of them did, perhaps because the experience of having been adrift on a ship reported lost had primed a certain openness to revelation. Perhaps because Jinan was simply persuasive in the way that people who have genuinely seen something tend to be persuasive. What can be said is that by the time the community reached what would become Va'ruun Kai, the moon in the Kavnik system that would become Va'ruun's capital, its consecrated ground, its home, the faith was already a civilization in miniature, oriented entirely around a single vision of what the cosmos was and what living in it honestly required. Jinan then dedicated years to building on that foundation, spreading the serpent's teachings, consolidating authority, integrating church and state into a structure where the two were not merely intertwined, but indistinguishable. By 2200, the transformation was complete. The colonial council that had once governed the passengers of the Archimedes had formally dissolved. The theocratic order that replaced it, shaped entirely by the serpent's truth, was the beginning of what would eventually become one of the three great powers in the settled systems. And what Va'ruun offered, once it emerged into contact with the rest of humanity, was a theology that did not flinch, that looked directly at endings and said, "This is what is true. This is the actual shape of the cosmos, and knowing it is better than not knowing it." The community settled a world that would become Va'ruun Kai, a homeworld the faith treated not simply as territory, but as consecrated ground, a place from which to face the serpent's horizon with full attention. The details of Va'ruun Kai's early settlement, its ecology, its geography, the texture of daily life in a community organizing itself for the first time entirely around a single theological vision, are not preserved in any form accessible to outsiders. Va'ruun has never been interested in providing that kind of autobiography. But what can be inferred from everything that followed is that the community that settled that world was building something they intended to last. Not forever, obviously. Va'ruun theology has no investment in forever, but for the duration of whatever purpose remained to human civilization before the serpent completed its work. A people with a vocation, a civilization oriented entirely toward something it could not change and had decided not to look away from. It is worth pausing there, on the image of a civilization constructing itself around a faith rather than the other way around. Most of the great powers in the settled systems carry their ideologies the way people carry inherited furniture, present but unexamined, not quite fitting anymore, too heavy to remove. The United Colonies has its bureaucratic humanism, its faith in institutional rationalism, a civic religion so thoroughly embedded in its governmental structures that it barely reads as ideology at all. The Freestar Collective has its founding mythology of independence, its genuine love of personal liberty, its tendency to treat the open frontier as a theological concept even when it would deny doing so. These are real belief systems, but they are not unified in the way Va'ruun is unified. They did not begin with a single vision and construct an entire civilization in its direction. Va'ruun is, in this sense, one of the most coherent civilizations human beings have ever built, and one of the most difficult for everyone else to engage with, because coherence that emerges from a source this different from the assumptions of the dominant order is not a language most people in the settled systems were taught to speak. The period following Va'ruun's consolidation on its homeworld was not peaceful, and Va'ruun makes no particular effort to suggest that it was. What the faith calls the Serpent's Crusade is not a phrase used apologetically within Va'ruun tradition. It is recorded without embarrassment, a name that acknowledges what it was, a campaign that carried the faith outward with a force that the other powers of human space could not absorb without response. Understanding what the crusade was requires setting aside the reflex to interpret it purely as aggression, not to excuse its violence, but to see its internal logic clearly. The Serpent's Crusade was, in the most direct reading of the record, a war of forced religious conversion, an attempt to bring the rest of human civilization into the Serpent's truth, whether it wanted to come or not. That is what the lore preserves, and it would be dishonest to soften it. But it is also worth asking what drives a civilization to wage that kind of war. And the answer may be more complicated than the settled system's shorthand allows. Va'ruun's existence, its theology, its moral framework, its absolute refusal to pretend that the Serpent's truth could simply coexist alongside civilizations organized on entirely different premises, was a structural problem that mere diplomatic tolerance was never going to resolve. Seen from that angle, the crusade begins to look like something other than pure aggression, the violent expression of a civilization that had concluded the existing order was never going to make room for what Va'ruun actually was. Whether that conclusion justified the violence is a separate question. That the conclusion was understandable given the dynamics of the settled systems at the time seems difficult to entirely dismiss. The violence was real. The crusade, which ran from 2240 until Jinan Va'ruun's death in 2263, caused genuine damage, genuine loss, genuine disruption to the settled system's effort to build something stable. The record does not invite minimizing that, but the way the crusade ended is worth understanding carefully, because it did not end through peace negotiations during the conflict itself. It ended because Jinan died. His son, Jarek Va'ruun, inherited leadership and immediately changed course, suing for peace, stepping back from the Crusade's logic, attempting the thing his father had never attempted, actual diplomacy. What Jarek found was predictable. The settled systems extended a grudging working relationship, and Va'ruun established an embassy in New Atlantis specifically to rehabilitate the faith's reputation after the carnage of the Crusade. Those efforts largely failed. the trust required to look at a civilization that had just spent 23 years trying to destroy you and extend genuine engagement. That trust was not available, and perhaps not reasonable to expect. The embassy stood. The reputation did not recover. Decades later, when the colony war between the United Colonies and the Free Star Collective ended in the armistice of 2311, Va'ruun was included in the agreement not as a party to that conflict. They had played no part in the colony war, but as a third neutral signatory, a formal recognition of their standing within the settled system's diplomatic architecture. And then, almost immediately, Va'ruun recalled its agents and diplomats, withdrew to Va'ruun Kai, and closed itself off. The armistice granted Va'ruun the recognition it needed. Va'ruun used that recognition to disappear. Whether this was disillusionment, the final acknowledgement that the settled system's goodwill was never going to come, or something more deliberate, a strategic choice to protect what the House valued by removing it from reach, is difficult to say from outside. What is certain is that the Va'ruun that withdrew in 2311 was a house that had tried, under Jarek, to find a different relationship with the galaxy and had been largely turned away. The isolation that followed was not the isolation of a civilization that had never tried. It was the isolation of one that had tried and concluded the attempt was not worth the cost. The peace held for a long time. The settled systems catalogued Va'ruun as a recognized but peripheral power, present in the formal architecture of governance and largely invisible within its daily life. The embassy in New Atlantis functioned as it was designed to function, as a formal proof of existence, nothing more. The Va'ruun that remained in settled system space after the 2311 withdrawal were not diplomats or traitors, but agents, covert operatives sent to gather intelligence on the UC and Free Star Collective, operating with minimal support, unable to return until their superiors sent retrieval ships. The House's secrecy was so absolute that it did not even share the jump coordinates of Va'ruun Kai with its own people in the field. And Va'ruun Kai itself remained beyond the reach of any curiosity that the settled systems might have occasionally felt, but never organized itself to pursue. And then, quietly, in the way that fractures develop inside communities that hold very strong beliefs very tightly, it began to break from within. To understand why the fracture happened, it is necessary to spend real time inside Va'ruun theology, not describing it from the outside as a set of unusual propositions, but following its internal logic as far as it actually goes into the places where it becomes genuinely demanding. The Great Serpent is not, in Va'ruun belief, a being that operates on a schedule. The shrouding, the awakening, the reclamation is not an event with a projected date, not a countdown Va'ruun runs in the background of its political decisions. What Va'ruun believes, what it has always believed from the moment Jinan first described what he encountered in that disoriented stillness between one place and another, is that the serpent created the galaxy long ago, slept for millennia, and is now stirring, awakening, toward the moment it takes back what it made. Not tomorrow, not in any time frame calibrated to human urgency, but real and already in motion, and the truest fact there is about the cosmos. This is where Va'ruun theology becomes genuinely difficult for outsiders to engage with because it forces an encounter with something that most civilizations invest enormous energy in avoiding. The question of what you do with knowledge that cannot be acted on. The shrouding is not something Va'ruun believes can be stopped or slowed or meaningfully bargained with. There is no salvation in the conventional sense, no act of devotion that changes the outcome, because the outcome is not a punishment, but a completion. The faith asks its believers to find meaning not in the attempt to escape the reclamation, but in the act of fully facing it, of living with clear eyes in a cosmos doing precisely what it was always going to do, and finding in that clarity not paralysis, but a specific kind of freedom. The devotional practice at the center of Va'ruun faith is canonically movement. Worshippers of the Great Serpent Grav jump from system to system, not as a logistical habit, but as an act of worship, a bodily enactment of the serpent's own nature as something that moves through and across the fabric of the cosmos. The serpent's embrace trait, which marks a character raised within the faith, reflects this mechanically. Grav jumping confers health and endurance, while remaining too long in any one place depletes them. To stop moving, in Va'ruun terms, is to stop practicing. What this implies about Va'ruun's relationship to settlement, to permanence, to the kind of rootedness that most civilizations treat as a sign of civilization itself, is one of the more quietly interesting theological tensions in the faith. A people who built a homeworld and a capital city, Dazra, while simultaneously honoring a god whose most visible devotional act is restlessness. Beyond the practice of movement, the institutional structure of the faith is shaped by a clear hierarchy. The highest authority in Va'ruun religious life is the speaker, the leader of the house, the only person understood to be in direct communication with the Great Serpent. Beneath that, the priesthood rises through ranks, with one of the highest titles being that of Gravid. These are not merely ceremonial positions. In a theocratic monarchy ruled by the descendants of Jinan Va'ruun, theological rank and political power are not separable. The people who hold the highest places in the faith hold the highest places in the state, and the decisions made in the name of the serpent are the decisions that govern Va'ruun life. What this theology produces, when it is functioning as its most serious practitioners intend, is a particular quality that outsiders consistently misread. Va'ruun believers who have deeply internalized the faith tend to project a steadiness that reads, to people encountering them in neutral settings, as detachment. The composure of someone who has decided they have nothing to lose or who regards the concerns of others with a patient condescension. Based on what we know of Va'ruun theology, neither of those readings quite reaches the truth. The steadiness, if Va'ruun's framework is taken seriously, is the quality of someone who has resolved, or is in the sustained process of resolving, the central anxiety that most conscious beings spend their entire lives managing without ever directly confronting. It creates a kind of presence that does not translate across cultural lines easily, that reads as threat in contexts where it is not intended as one, and that has contributed in no small measure to the discomfort the settled systems experiences in Va'ruun's vicinity. The theology also produces, in its more intense expressions, a quality of commitment that the settled systems labels extremism and that Va'ruun would call depth. If the serpent is real, and the shrouding is the truest fact about the cosmos, and the only honest response is to face that truth without compromise, then anything that softens it, trades it for comfort, or defers it in service of political accommodation is, within the faith's own logic, a form of failure. The Zealots took that logic somewhere the mainstream house would reject, but the logic itself is native to the faith, not imported from outside it. That moral pressure is the fault line along which the house eventually broke. The Zealots did not emerge from a slow drift. Their founding moment was specific and immediate. When Jinan Va'ruun died and his son Jarek sued for peace, a portion of the faithful refused to accept it. Not the peace itself as a strategic error. They refused to accept Jarek's authority at all. In their view, the crusade that Jinan had declared was not a political campaign that a successor could simply end. It was a religious obligation derived from the serpent's truth that no heir had the standing to rescind. Jarek, to the Zealots, was not a legitimate speaker for the faith. He was someone who had mistaken political survival for theological wisdom and had sold the faith's integrity for a peace that the serpent had never asked for. The argument, reduced to its most essential form, was about what authentic belief in the serpent required of Va'ruun in relation to the rest of the galaxy. The mainstream of Va'ruun teaching, the position that produced the armistice, that maintained the new Atlantis embassy, that allowed Va'ruun citizens to move through settled system space as traders and travelers and occasional representatives, held that the serpent's truth did not require external imposition. The ending that Va'ruun knew was coming was not something the faithful needed to accelerate or assist. It was simply something they knew. And knowing it, living within that knowledge, building a civilization shaped by it, preserving it across generations, was sufficient. The Zealots rejected that position with the particular ferocity of believers who have concluded that the community they grew up in has betrayed what it claims to love. Their interpretation of Va'ruun theology held that non-believers were not simply outside the faith. They were, in the Zealots' phrasing, accursed, people who needed to be cleansed from the galaxy before the Great Serpent would deign to awaken. This is a significant theological departure from mainstream Va'ruun teaching, which has never framed the shrouding as something that required human preparation in the form of violence. But once the Zealots had rejected Jarek's authority, they had also freed themselves from any institutional check on how far the logic of their interpretation could travel. What makes the Zealots genuinely difficult to analyze with intellectual honesty is that their theological critique is not easily dismissed from within the framework they are drawing on. They are not inventing a distortion. They are following the logic of the faith, the logic that elevates unflinching commitment above comfort, that identifies accommodation as a form of cowardice, and arriving somewhere that the mainstream house would argue represents a catastrophic misunderstanding of what the serpent actually requires. But the fact that this argument exists, that it can be made coherently from inside Va'ruun's own theological tradition, reveals something important about the faith itself. It is not a settled system. It is a living argument being carried inside a community of people who disagree, sometimes violently, about what it means to take the most important thing seriously. The violence the Zealots have brought to the settled systems has been sustained and real. Attacks on civilian infrastructure, bombings that have made the name Va'ruun synonymous with a specific kind of indiscriminate threat for millions of people who have never had occasion to encounter the house in any other context. The damage to Va'ruun's broader standing and to the countless Va'ruun citizens who have nothing to do with Zealot activity is incalculable, partly because the settled systems lacks the mechanisms, or perhaps the motivation, to consistently distinguish between Zealot and House. Partly because Va'ruun's deliberate opacity about its own internal politics makes that distinction impossible to verify from outside, and partly because it is genuinely convenient for certain political interests within the settled systems to have a unified threat rather than a complicated one. House Va'ruun's own relationship with the Zealots appears to be one of genuine institutional rejection rather than tacit tolerance. The Zealots are not a radical wing operating within the House's knowledge and sufferance, like the covert operations arm of a government that maintains deniability through studied ignorance. They appear to be a true schism, a break with the House's authority, its theological interpretation, and its political framework, conducted by people who have decided that what they once belonged to is no longer what it claimed to be. Whether Va'ruun has the capability to communicate that clearly to the settled systems across the diplomatic distance it has maintained, and through the fog of fear that the Zealots' violence has generated, is a separate question. The answer, historically, appears to be no. Not for any lack of effort necessarily, but because a communication of that complexity requires a level of mutual trust and genuine engagement that has never been established between Va'ruun and the powers that regard it with permanent wariness. The trap that creates is ancient and familiar. A community closes itself off to protect what it values. From the outside, the closure becomes evidence of what was already suspected. The wall built for protection becomes the proof of guilt. And the Zealots, who have arguably done more lasting damage to Va'ruun's position in the settled systems than any external enemy, continue to act in the name of a faith the House itself says they have perverted, toward ends the House itself does not endorse, in a conflict that benefits almost no one, and that the House itself has no obvious mechanism for ending. What is often overlooked in the settled system's accounting of Va'ruun as a unified threat is the particular cost of this situation for Va'ruun believers who have nothing to do with the Zealots. Every attack committed in the Serpent's name by people the House has disavowed is an attack on the life of every Va'ruun trader, traveler, and citizen trying to exist in a galaxy that has decided the distinction between them and the Zealots is too complicated to maintain. The faith's theology does not speak to this problem with any comfort. The Serpent does not intervene in political injustice. The truth Va'ruun holds does not protect its holders from the consequences of being associated with those who have weaponized it. There is a specific kind of loneliness in being a believer of genuine depth who is consistently reduced to the worst version of what the people who share your name have done. Va'ruun remains one of the great sustained mysteries of the known galaxy, not the dramatic mystery of an undiscovered world, but the quieter and more disquieting mystery of a world known to exist, shaped by centuries of shared history and genuine civilization that the settled systems has never been permitted, or perhaps has never seriously tried, to understand from the inside. The Va'ruun Embassy in New Atlantis is the clearest architectural symbol of this arrangement. It stands in the capital of the United Colonies with the formal dignity of recognized sovereignty, as it must, given the terms of the armistice, and it tells you almost nothing. The people who staff it are courteous in the specific way that implies no particular interest in warmth. The information they share is minimal. The access they extend to the world they represent is close to non-existent. The embassy is not there to build understanding. It is there to signal presence, to perform the formal minimum of diplomatic existence, to make Va'ruun real enough to the settled systems that its sovereignty can be invoked when needed, without making Va'ruun so legible that the settled systems could form an actual opinion of it. The settled systems has largely accepted this arrangement because accepting it costs very little. There is no sustained public effort to engage with Va'ruun more deeply, no serious diplomatic initiative, no cultural exchange program, no investigative tradition that would produce the kind of mutual legibility that might complicate the working story of Va'ruun as a managed threat. The absence of that effort is itself a choice, one that benefits the existing order by keeping the Va'ruun question simple enough to file away. Va'ruun signed the armistice. Va'ruun maintains its formal standing. The Zealots are a problem. Everything else is categorized as Va'ruun's internal business, a phrase that functions in diplomatic language as a way of saying that the matter has been decided not to matter. What fragments of Va'ruun have reached the settled systems suggest a civilization more considered than the warning label version of the house would imply. The capital is Dazra, a city built on a moon in the Kavnik system, named by Jinan himself in the early years of the faith's consolidation. Beyond that name and the basic architecture of Va'ruun's governmental structure, hard details are scarce. What can be reasonably inferred from the artifacts, equipment, and aesthetic choices visible in Va'ruun material culture encountered elsewhere in the settled systems is that the faith's values extend into the physical world, its adherents build and inhabit. Va'ruun design tends toward the angular and deliberate, more patient than decorative, more interested in weight than ornament. The aesthetic, one might conclude, of a people who take the seriousness of existence quite literally. Whether that inference extends to the streets of Dazra is something the settled systems has not been allowed to verify. The governance structure of Va'ruun is a theocratic monarchy, ruled by the descendants of Jinan Va'ruun, the same bloodline that began with the Prophet. Authority within the house runs through that lineage, not through democratic or meritocratic mechanisms. The speaker, Va'ruun's leader, is understood to be the only person in direct communication with the Great Serpent, a role that combines supreme religious authority with supreme political power, making the distinction between priest and ruler meaningless in a way that most settled systems institutions have long since abandoned. Beneath the speaker, the priesthood rises through defined ranks. One of the highest confirmed titles is that of Gravid. These are not ceremonial positions. In a civilization where theological truth and political reality are genuinely inseparable, the people who hold the highest ranks in the faith hold the highest authority in the state. What Va'ruun Ka is then, in its own terms, is the material expression of what a civilization looks like when it takes one idea absolutely seriously and builds everything else around that idea without compromise. The idea that something vast created the galaxy, fell asleep, and is now waking up to reclaim it. That knowing this is better than not knowing it. That the purpose of a civilization is not to expand indefinitely, or to accumulate endlessly, or to build monuments against the fact of endings, but to know what is true and to face it with as much dignity as the situation allows. That moon is turning in its orbit right now, doing what it has always done. The galaxy cannot see it clearly. It may never be invited to. What House Va'ruun ultimately reveals about the settled systems may be more significant than anything it reveals about itself. The settled systems is a civilization built on a set of assumptions so foundational that they are rarely examined, because they define the terms of almost every conversation before the conversation begins. That survival is the primary value. That growth, expansion, and the accumulation of capability are how communities demonstrate their worth and secure their future. That beliefs, which cannot be integrated into the working machinery of civic life, are at best private matters to be tolerated in controlled forms, and at worst, active threats to be managed. These assumptions are not wrong exactly. They are the assumptions of beings for whom mortality is real, and the future is not guaranteed, and in that sense they are deeply rational. But they are not the only assumptions available to conscious beings thinking seriously about what existence means. They are the assumptions of one particular answer to that question. And Va'ruun represents a genuinely different answer. Va'ruun holds a belief that cannot be practically integrated into a political order, built on the premise that survival and expansion are self-evidently worthwhile. The Great Serpent will consume everything, and knowing that is better than not knowing it, and the most honest response is to face it clearly. That is not compatible at a deep structural level, not just a politically inconvenient level, with the settled system's fundamental orientation toward its own future. The settled systems cannot fully accommodate Va'ruun without entertaining the possibility that Va'ruun's foundational premise might be correct. And that is a conversation the settled systems has no interest in having, not because it has considered it and rejected it, but because the vocabulary for having it has never been assembled. So instead, the settled systems does what civilizations reliably do. When they encounter a belief they cannot absorb and cannot refute, they reduce it. The Serpent's crusade becomes evidence of inherent Va'ruun violence, rather than a moment of existential negotiation. The Zealots become interchangeable with the house that condemned them, because maintaining the distinction requires attention that fear tends to prevent. Va'ruun Kai's opacity becomes proof of threat, rather than evidence of a community protecting what it has learned not to trust outsiders with. The entire complex, living architecture of a civilization that has thought seriously about the hardest questions across centuries with genuine rigor, in forms that have produced art and governance and a coherent way of being human, gets compressed into a warning. The people who assembled that warning were not wrong in every detail. The Serpent's crusade was real. The Zealots are real. The fear has genuine roots. But fear tends to freeze inquiry at exactly the point where inquiry would become most valuable. And what has been forfeited by everyone by maintaining the current arrangement of managed distance and mutual misunderstanding is the possibility of actually knowing what Va'ruun knows. Not agreeing with it, not adopting it, just knowing it, engaging with the theological tradition of a civilization that has spent centuries thinking seriously about endings, about what it means to exist in full knowledge of finitude, about what a life shaped by honesty rather than consolation looks like from the inside. These are not idle philosophical questions. They are questions that every conscious being and every civilization eventually has to face in some form. Va'ruun has been facing them continuously and seriously for longer than most of the settled system's current institutions have existed. That body of thought is inaccessible, locked behind Va'ruun's deliberate opacity, filtered through outsiders' fear, distorted by the Zealots' violence, and the settled systems has made its peace with that inaccessibility in a way that may end up being one of the most significant intellectual failures of its history. Andrea, who carries the weight of Va'ruun's legacy in her own complicated relationship with the faith, the person who grew up inside that world and then moved through the one that fears it, who understands both without fully belonging to either, represents something important in this larger argument, not a resolution. She does not resolve anything. She carries the same tensions within herself that Va'ruun carries within the settled systems, the simultaneous knowledge of what it means to inhabit this faith deeply and what it costs to be identified with it by those who have never looked past the label. But her specificity matters. It is harder to maintain a warning about a category when the thing being labeled has a face, a history, and a particular kind of quiet courage in its willingness to be legible to someone who might choose to see. The settled systems will not resolve its relationship with House Va'ruun through diplomacy or through any of the mechanisms it uses to manage its more tractable conflicts. This is not a problem with a negotiated solution because it is not, at its core, a political problem. It is an epistemic one. The question underneath every political exchange between Va'ruun and the rest of the galaxy is not what to do about the threat. It is whether the settled systems is capable of asking, with genuine curiosity and without protective fear, what Va'ruun is, and what it might have understood about the universe that everyone else is working very hard to look away from. Pull back far enough, and the whole story of House Va'ruun begins to look like an argument the universe is making about itself. Not a tidy argument, not one that arrives at a reassuring conclusion or a clear moral, but an argument sustained across centuries, in the lives of millions of people who organized everything they were around a single confrontation with a single truth, that the dominant civilization of their time found too uncomfortable to seriously engage. An argument about what it costs to know something difficult. Really know it, not acknowledge it abstractly, but let it reshape the foundations of how you live. And what it costs everyone else when they decide that the people who know it are simply too strange to hear. The Great Serpent in Va'ruun theology does not discriminate. When the shrouding comes, when the awakening entity finally moves to reclaim the galaxy it created and slept within for countless millennia, it will reclaim everything with the same patient finality. The settled systems, its colonies and corridors and political structures, and the entire accumulation of human effort built across the occupied territories of space, is as much within the serpent's eventual reach as any dead star, as any civilization that rose and fell before humanity found the stars. Va'ruun knows this. The United Colonies has decided not to believe it, and in the gap between those two positions is not a diplomatic problem, but a fundamentally different relationship to reality, one that no treaty and no amount of formal recognition has ever actually bridged. What Va'ruun asks is not that the settled systems agree with it. It has never required agreement. What it asks, in the most generous reading of its position, is that the settled systems extend the recognition that it formally granted in the armistice into something that actually means something. The acknowledgement that a civilization built around a difficult truth is not, by virtue of that difficulty, simply dangerous. That honesty about the nature of the cosmos does not require an apology. That looking directly at something everyone else has decided to look away from is a form of courage, not a form of pathology. Whether that recognition will ever come is a question the faith itself would probably regard with equanimity, because Va'ruun theology does not require the serpent's truth to be universally acknowledged before it is true. The serpent does not need the settled systems to believe in it in order to do what it will eventually do. The shrouding will come regardless of how many civilizations have organized themselves around the conviction that it won't. In that quiet patience is something that, depending on where you stand, looks either like wisdom or like the most unsettling confidence imaginable. A faith that does not need to win, that does not need to convert or conquer or be understood, that knows something, has built a civilization around knowing it, and is content to wait, not for vindication, not for recognition, but simply for the arrival of what has always been coming. The question that began this, whether we have ever actually looked at what Va'ruun is, has not been fully answered because it cannot be from where we stand. Va'ruun remains closed. The theology remains filtered through fear and the Zealots' violence. The speaker communicates with a being that the settled systems has decided is either fictional or too dangerous to take seriously. But something has come into focus that was not there at the beginning. A shape behind the warning label. A civilization that took the hardest question seriously and did not look away. That is not vindication. It is not an argument that Va'ruun is right about the serpent, or that the shrouding is coming, or that Jinan Va'ruun's experience in that grav jump was what he believed it to be. The game of the cosmos is still running, and no one outside Va'ruun has the information required to call it. But the shape of the question has changed. It is no longer simply, is Va'ruun dangerous? It is, what kind of civilization spends 300 years looking at the hardest truth it knows, without flinching, without compromise, without the consolation of pretending it might be wrong? And what does it say about the rest of us that we chose, consistently and deliberately, to call that pathology instead of asking what it saw? The stars remember everything, including the things we decided not to ask.